start recording. Yeah, so let's jump into what is science. Hopefully you had a chance to look at the pre-lecture. I highly encourage you to look at the pre-lecture before the lecture, just because there will be questions I ask that come right from the pre-lecture, like, so just in the chat, type in the answer. Science can be conceived in several distinct ways. In this course, we will focus primarily on science as an A, content, B, method, or C, attitude. So this is coming directly from that pre-lecture. Just in the chat, type in what you think the answer is. All right, seeing a lot of B's. Let me do something real quick. Yes. We will be focusing on science as a method. Good job. And so hopefully you, so it seems like, yeah, everyone's in method. So make sure you are looking at that pre-lecture. Dr. Holtz goes over just some things that set up the actual lecture. And yeah, so that would be this is a really good example of a question that will be on a quiz and the exam. So I guarantee you that on the exam that you'll take, or the quiz that you'll take this Friday, there's going to be a question somewhat similar to this. So these are the type of questions to look out for. They will, for the most part, really like 99% of the time, come directly from the PowerPoint. All right, one more question put in the chat. Dr. Sugar finds that residents of Fayetteville, West Virginia have an unusually high rate of obesity. She conducts a study to determine whether people would increase their physical activity if a park was built in the community. This should be considered basic, applied, evaluative, or quantitative research. All right, here we go. Who wants to be the first person? All right, so I'm seeing a lot of C's, and this may be a result of first person took the plunge and said C, and so everyone else just followed suit. But the answer actually is B, and I can see why people would think that it's C. But let's work through this a little bit. So we're actually applying, so we know that physical activity is important, right? And we're looking at applying that in a community setting. So evaluative would be would say the park, is that what we're doing? Of a park. So evaluative would be, oh, hey, we actually built a park and we're now seeing if that is effective in increasing physical activity. I was trying to figure out what we were studying here. So applying, we're actually applying this to the community. So that's why it's applied. But evaluative is when something is already done and we want to evaluate if it is effective or not. So that's when it would be considered evaluative. All right, so yeah, so make sure that if you need to, go back through that pre-lecture PowerPoint, and read up more on the differences between basic, applied, and evaluative, because once again, I guarantee you there's going to be a question on the exam and on the quiz this week asking you to differentiate between all of these. All right, so let's get away from the pre-lecture stuff. Let's jump into today's lecture. And what are we going to be talking about? So we are going to focus on how we know things, as well as then get into the scientific method. And we're not going to go into too much detail of the scientific method. Hopefully this is not a new concept, probably something that came up in, I'm assuming, high school at some point, maybe in an introductory to psych class. But let's jump into first looking at how we know things in a non-scientific way. So we all know a lot of facts, right? People know a lot of facts about movie trivia or sports or food or whatever domain that you can think of. We all know things, right? But it's very important to understand how we know these things or where these facts come from. So let's jump into how we know things in a non-scientific way. One of the things I'm going to suggest for the upcoming slides is, in reference to the exam, is to, understand like what tenacity is and be able to read something and be like, is this tenacity? Is this, we'll get into other ones like intuition or empiricism, excuse me. So one of the things that I'm going to want you to focus on is, really what is tenacity and some examples of tenacity. So what is tenacity? Tenacity, think of tenacity as like custom or traditions or folklore, wives' tales. It's just known to be this way. So these are things that maybe are just handed down through time, you pick up at some point, and you just hear it a lot, right? So you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Where did this even come from, right? You can definitely teach older dogs new tricks. Men never ask for directions when they get lost. I'm sure some male in this class at one point has asked for directions at some point in their life. So think of some other things. So something like, has anyone ever heard of the wives' tale? You shouldn't swim after eating. Like you should wait like 10 to 15 minutes after eating to go swim. That is not scientifically proven to matter at all. Think about some of the like gender tests for a baby that hasn't been born yet. Like if the mom likes sweet versus salty things, like one of that means girl, one of that means a boy. There's like a garlic test. There's all these small little things that have just been handed down through time that aren't really scientifically based in anything. And so there's some problems with these, right? So are they accurate? No, right? They're just not accurate. You may think that they're accurate, but they're not scientifically proven to be accurate at all. And they may come about as a result of the mere exposure effect. So does anyone want to take the plunge and volunteer? What is the mere exposure effect? If you think you know, just unmute yourself and shout it out.
It's when you're not used to something, so the more you see it, the more you're familiar with it, and the more that you like it or appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, so the mere exposure effect is just simply the more you hear something or the more you are exposed to something, the more likely you are to remember it and like it. So think commercials really take advantage of this. If you've ever heard the same commercial in the same like commercial like slot, like 10-minute slot of commercials or whatever while you're watching TV or you're on Spotify or whatever, there's a reason for that you hear the same commercial and over again. They want you to remember it. So there's a reason for it. So the mere exposure effect, that may be how some of these tenacity facts / or what you think are facts come about. And people may have a problem with refusing to accept contradictory evidence from ideas that come out of tenacity. So, people may just refuse to believe, anything other than what they've always believed, and that these things have come through folklore, just handed down through time. Yeah, so for the purposes of an exam or a test, make sure you kind of have an understanding what tenacity is. And I may give you an example, and you would have to tell me, like, is this tenacity or not? All right, so the next level, and this is slightly better than tenacity, is intuition. So, and this should be probably a little bit more familiar to people, but intuition is this hunch / feeling that something is correct. And it's often based on past experience or knowledge, even if you can't explain it. So, how many people here have ever done or are familiar with the idea of, or the like the game of a fantasy draft league? And you have a bunch of players, right? And you are trying to pick out the best ones for that week. And you might just have a hunch that this person is going to be slightly better than that person, so I'm going to put them in the lineup. And it might not really be based on anything other than like, oh, I think this person is just going to, I think they're going to have a really good week this week. Yeah, so this is intuition. And once again, the problem is it's difficult to determine accuracy. You know, are these feelings accurate? Kind of hard to figure that out. All right, so intuition's pretty easy. We all have these hunch or gut feelings. Which goes slightly a little bit better than tenacity and intuition and authority. So we can get facts or we can get knowledge from authority. So this is where, as what it sounds like, a trusted authority figure just tells you the facts. And this can be incredibly useful, right? Listening to authority or listening to someone who's knowledgeable in that field can be really beneficial, especially if you're not familiar with that. But there's also obviously problems with listening to authority or an authority figure. You know, what is the basis of the claims that this authority figure is making? How do you know that the authority figure is correct? I told you, or rather Taylor did, but I confirmed it, the definition of the mere exposure effect. And I'm assuming, let's say you've never heard of the mere exposure effect. I'm assuming no one questioned my definition of it, right? You just assumed that it was correct. And it was. The definition I gave for you for that was correct. But I'm assuming a majority of you just said, okay, yeah, he's the teacher. What he said is right. And these claims can often go unchallenged. So you may just assume that what you've heard from authority figures are correct. Kids do it all the time. You know, you can say something to a kid, and because you're the adult, you should know they just believe what you say. But adults do this all the time as well. You know, how many times have someone like saw something on a news channel and been like, oh, this is just true. And that's not always the case. So yeah, authority, slightly better than intuition, but obviously not all authority figures can be giving you factual information. Rationalism. So this one's a little bit more difficult to think about, but this is really the basis of philosophy. So you start with basic principles, and then you use logic or reasoning to establish new facts. And so here's an example. All presidents tell the truth. You start off with something like, all presidents tell the truth. Well, Donald Trump is a president. Therefore, Donald Trump tells the truth. And obviously there's a problem with this, right? If you start off with this flawed logic, everything else is going to be flawed. However, let's say you don't think that that first thing is flawed, right? Let's say you're someone who thinks that, yeah, the president always tells the truth, right? And some people actually do have this mentality. And now I'm just picking on this president idea, but this can apply to many different things. But if you have this false premise that all presidents tell the truth, or presidents will only tell the truth, then your natural conclusion working through is, well, Donald Trump's always telling the truth. And we just know that that's not true. Despite what you think of Donald Trump or not, you know, not everyone tells the truth all the time. Here's another example of one. All kids like candy. That's a pretty safe assumption, right? All kids like candy. Well, black licorice is candy, therefore all kids like black licorice, right? So it's just not, if you start off with this false premise or this false basic principle, and you continue on with logic, right, stuff that is logical, you still end up with something that could be wrong. So this could be a problem with rationalism. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions about tenacity, intuition, authority, or rationalism that I can answer? I know I went through them relatively fast, but I think, you know, they're relatively straightforward. As long as you can understand what each one is, and if I would give you an example of something, you'd be able to tell me if it's rationalism, is it intuition, is it authority, then you should be fine. But yeah, any questions about what we talked about so far? All right. So next up is empiricism, and this is the closest to science, but not quite. So empiricism is the idea that knowledge is based on direct observation. And thinking about psychology, can someone tell me why this might be a problem? Or what could be the problem with this idea that knowledge is based on direct observation? This is a little tricky one. Seneca, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, here, I'll turn my camera off actually too. The first thing that popped in my mind is when I took Psych 101, we talked about how when like asking people questions, being in the room even can and what's the word? Sorry. It can like change the results just being in the room with someone, and not everything can be observed. Like we can't necessarily, I don't know, if you're asking a question about space and you're in high school, you can't necessarily, buy a rocket and go to the moon or,
Sure.
know.
Yeah, things like theoretical physics, you can't observe subatomic particles, or maybe you can now, I don't know, but you used to not be able to. So yeah, so like that, you can't necessarily observe them. Going back to your point with the people who change their behavior, if someone else is in the room, so they might want to get like a social desire. There might be like a social desirability effect where your participant may alter their behavior because they think they're being watched, right? So this happens all the time, actually. I do a lot, or the grant I was working on, we did a big survey with adolescents. And one of the questions was, one of the questions we asked about like is substance use. And a lot of the times they just don't want to answer right because they think that we're going to rat on them or something. And even funnier, like we also do a breath holding task, not related at all to if they're using substances or not, right? We just want to see how long they can hold their breath, which may be an indication of what is it? How long they'll be able to withstand like bad things. Anyways, but we went into a school once, and I noticed that these kids were always asking, like a bunch of kids were asking to use the bathroom. And it turns out they thought that we were going to do, they thought when they saw breath holding that we were going to do like test their breath if they were doing tobacco. And so we were like this really rural West Virginia school. I forget which one it was. But yeah, so a lot of these kids were using chewing tobacco, like adolescents. They were like 14, 15-year-olds were doing chewing tobacco and going into the bathrooms to scrub their mouth with soap because they thought we were testing for that stuff. So yeah, this behavior, and this is a weird story, but I just thought it was funny. But yeah, so participants will change their behavior if they think they're being watched. Some people may perceive the same event or situation differently. Yes. So I'm seeing all these. I'm seeing a couple good answers. That was a good answer, Seneca. Yeah. So just pure observation is not always beneficial because perception doesn't always equal reality. People may alter their behavior, but we also really care, to Justin's point, that people perceive things differently. And that's really what matters in psychology. So so two people may experience the same event, right? Two kids may experience the same adverse event, and one kid isn't affected all that much, right? They don't show any negative signs, and another kid turns to drugs and is extremely depressed. And so yeah. So perception, we really care about perception, about what people are perceiving and thinking about. And then not all phenomena are directly observable, right? How do you observe happiness? Well, you kind of can, right? You can look at smiles, and you could look at maybe some, I don't know, serotonin levels or whatever. How do you, but it's kind of hard to observe happiness because I can still be very happy and not smiling, right? You can still be very sad and not crying. So how do you actually measure things? It's not all, you can't always do it based off of observation. However, this is the approach of basic science. This is observing things. And we'll see that we'll build off of that, actually, I think on the next slide or two. but this empiricism is the basis of science. All right. So I want you to think about this for like 30 seconds, and then I'm going to ask for some volunteers, but I want you to explain why you think it is what it is. So this idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. How do you know this? Is it through tenacity, intuition, authority, rationalism, or empiricism? So use that raise hand feature. And let's see, chat. Sydney. All right, Sydney, you said C, authority. Why do you think it is authority?
I feel like people like their parents will just feel like breakfast is the most important meal of the day, or like doctors will just say like you should always be eating breakfast, so then you kind of just do that as in like kind of like a routine type of thing, I guess you would say.
Sure, you've heard it from your parents, right? You hear it from commercials. Breakfast commercials, you know, they're always big. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Hear it from doctors. I see a bunch of A's, tenacity. It's just a known fact. That's also true. You know, it's just something that you've heard handed down from parent, you know, from generation to generation. Is breakfast is the most important meal. How about, I see some A's, C. How about D, rationalism? Do you think it could be that? I see some head shakes of no. Does anyone take a, but it could be. I think it could be rationalism. Honestly, it could be any one of these. So this is one of the things I want to, empiricism. So like empiricism. Maybe you test it yourself and one day you don't eat, what I'm trying to say, one day you don't eat breakfast and then you are grouchy, and the next day you do eat breakfast and you aren't as grouchy. Not saying that's the best way to, that's not the most scientific way, but it's definitely a way to determine that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. So you really could do, you could apply this concept to pretty much just everyone. Rationalism may be a little bit more harder to conceptualize through. It can be rationalism if you assume sugary cereal is a breakfast, so you're saying it's cereal. So yeah, you could work through it. So one of the questions on a good exam question could be to, you know, I could have said, you know, Brett, how do you know this? And there's no right answer, right? As long as you could pick one and give me a solid explanation as to why it's authority, that would be the correct answer. So this could be a good open-ended question where, you know, I give you this and you have to choose one and explain in a few sentences why you think it is what it is. Now for the weekly quizzes, it's all purely multiple choice, but there are a couple open-ended questions on the exams. So it is something to keep in mind. But yes, it could be all of them, and just depending on how you apply your logic. All right. So let's switch gears from non-scientific ways into the scientific method. Hopefully this is something that you should have a general idea of what the scientific method is, but let's go into it a little bit more. So scientific method, it's the method of acquiring and modifying knowledge through systematic observation. And then you combine it with evaluation, interpretation, and theoretical explanation for what you have observed. So it's based on this systematic empiricism. Remember, let's go back. Empiricism, knowledge is based on direct observation. That was a weird transition, didn't know that was there. So we're based on this systematic empiricism, or this, you know, knowledge based on observation, determine facts, and then we're going to use kind of rationalism to reason about those facts. The bottom point is a really key point to the scientific method, and that these observations should be open to anyone's direct experience. And what does this really mean? It means that these conclusions or your methods should be repeatable by anyone at any time. So one of the key things in science is being able to repeat your study in a different sample, in a different population, and find the same results, right? If I want to look at the effect that social media has on, I don't know, self-esteem, and I do a study on emerging adults. So I do a study on this class. In order for me to, if I put my findings out there and someone else does a study on emerging adults in a psychology class and find something different, maybe there was a problem with my results. So studies should be able to be repeated multiple times and the findings come out. And that's a really key point to, at least, well, I guess all science, but I know especially in psychological science, is you constantly want to keep on redoing studies and finding the same results. All right. So we got to take an aside to this though. So psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And we've kind of already touched on this idea, but we understand that behavior can be observed, right? We can look at smiling, or we can look at decision making, and we can see what decisions people made. But mental processes cannot be directly observed, right? And we've already talked about this. So many of the questions in which we are most interested in involve unobservable constructs. But think about like self-esteem. How would you really measure self-esteem by observation? I mean, you kind of maybe could at some point. Perhaps you would like, I don't even like, you could maybe, I don't know, people I guess who have like low self-esteem, maybe when they see an image would look at certain things. Like if they see another image of someone, would look at different things than someone who has high self-esteem. Maybe, I don't know. It would be really hard to measure self-esteem through observation because it's a mental process. So we infer a lot of these from behavior, but science really uses operational definitions. So this is a key term that we're going to explore more. But science uses operational definitions to ensure that other researchers can observe the same constructs in the same way. So I have a question to throw out to you. How I want to measure, let's say we want to do a study on social media, right? We just want to see how social media is related to self-esteem. How could we measure social media? There's multiple different ways. So someone, just unmute yourself, shout it out. How would you measure social media?
Like how long people spend on the apps or something?
Sure. So we could have time, right? We could just have a measure of purely how long in minutes have you spent using social media? How else can we do it?
You could do like different like age ranges of who's on social media.
Sure, we could be looking at that if we wanted to assess. Yeah, we could look at that descriptives, what different, are adolescents using it, or older adults using it, how long they're using it. How else could we measure social media use? So we have time spent on it. Is there anything else?
You could also do what apps people are using the most.
Sure. What apps are people using? Potentially how many apps do they use, right? There's a difference if someone just uses one app versus 20 apps. So there's a range right there. Are there any other ways we can measure social media use?
How many interactions they have on social media, so like how many likes, how many people do they follow, and like how many people they text.
Sure. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things right there. So what are they actually doing? Are they getting lots of likes on their pictures, not as much likes? Are they actively engaging with people? Are they passively using social media? So are you just scrolling through Instagram, and not really participating? But you're just looking through content. Are you actively using Instagram? Are you posting stuff? Are you commenting on other people's? Are you DMing? So there are lots and lots of different ways to measure social media use. You can do social media addiction, whether someone's addicted to using social media or not. So having a clear and concise operational definition is very, very important. And this is something that whenever we start to get into breakout, we start to go out into groups and coming up with ideas for your correlational study, this is something I really want you to focus on, is this operational definition, or what really are you measuring? Because if you just say, well, I want to measure social media use, right here, we just talked about 10 different ways that you can measure social media use. And every single way may have different implications for whatever you're studying. And so having a good operational definition, or rather what exactly are you studying or measuring, is very important for multiple reasons, but also this allows other researchers to measure the same thing that you're measuring. So that way you can, going back to the previous slide, you can repeat research and you can confirm findings. But having a good operational definition is very important. Any questions so far? All right, let's jump into steps of the scientific method. So first, we need to identify a problem. What do we want to know about the world? Now, no research study ever just comes about because someone's like, I wonder this. No research study nowadays, maybe 200 years ago, 300 years ago, maybe that's how it came about. But yeah, no study now is just like, I wonder this. It's really based off of literature that you have read. So what is already known? What have other people found? And what new ideas does this spark? A good research study, no research study is ever just, this is the end all, there's nothing else we can learn. This is the last research study on this topic ever. That never happens. There's always something else that you can do as a result of the study that you just conducted. And so this is how you form a hypothesis. Now, forming a hypothesis is something that we're going to focus on more on, I believe, on Friday, but we'll bring it up here. But what is a hypothesis? This is your prediction. It's a testable claim about what you expect to observe in a research study. It's what you think will happen. So yeah, so here's another question to throw out, and I want to see some answers in the chat for this. Why is forming the hypothesis arguably the most important part of the scientific method? So take a second, look through these answers, and just type in the chat what you think it is. All right, I'm seeing a lot of B's. Yeah, the answer here is B. A well-formed hypothesis dictates the design of the study. And we're going to focus a little bit more on that later in this presentation, but also really on this Friday. But just know that a good hypothesis, or rather a well-formed hypothesis, a well-thought-out hypothesis, really does dictate how your study is going to look like. It sets up your methodology. It sets up the analyses that you're going to use. If you have a untestable or a bad hypothesis, maybe one that makes too many claims, you can't just test it. So a well-formed hypothesis really does dictate the design of the study. It is probably the most important part of the scientific study. Second, I think, is also methodology, but we'll get more into that later. So let me I need to get rid of this. All right, where are we? Okay, so we talked about the hypothesis as a prediction, a testable claim about what you expect to observe in a research study, but hypotheses can come about in different ways. Now, and we're going to focus on two right here, but all of this comes from reviewing the literature, but some hypotheses can test an explanation for the phenomenon of interest. So if I think that social media and self-esteem are related. So prior research has said that, right? That people who use social media are more likely to have lower self-esteem. Well, I'm reading this research, and then the first question that should come to mind is, well, why? Why do people who use social media have lower self-esteem? And one of the reasons may be, well, we know that people compare themselves to others, so let's look at social comparison. And what we find out is that we know that people who engage in upwards social comparisons, or they compare themselves to others who are more well off, are likely to have lower self-esteem. So this is one way that a hypothesis can come about, because we're looking to explain the relationship between two things. I'm looking to explain the relationship between social media and self-esteem. Other times, hypotheses can come about because you question the methodology of previous research. And so this really comes about, my dissertation idea came about because of this way. And I didn't even know that, couldn't even put it to words that I questioned the methodology of previous research. But I'm reading all this prior literature, and they constantly show that social media is bad, right? It's for the most part, it's bad to well-being. So it's related to depression, anxiety, lower self-esteem, lower happiness. And I realized that, and so one of the ways that I talked about how you can measure social media use is passive and active. So passive use is just scrolling through Instagram, not engaging, you're just looking at content. Active use is like actively using. And what research has actually shown is that actively using social media, so like actually posting on Instagram and all this, is actually beneficial to well-being. For some reason, posting and actually engaging decreases depression, decreases anxiety. And that passively using, so just scrolling through looking at stuff, is related to depression, anxiety, lower self-esteem. So that's bad. And in my head, I'm like, wait, that doesn't make sense. Because not all content on social media is made the same, right? Looking at the Kardashians is not the same as looking at cute puppy pictures, right? And you can get all of that on Instagram. And it really depends how you're using social media. It can dictate whether you experience positive or negative consequences. And I was like, why has no research looked at this? And really, no research has looked at this, this idea that content can matter. And it goes back to the methodology, because if you look at how they assess passive use, they just say, they literally, it's one question, and we ask, how, in the past hour, how long have you just spent browsing social media? Well, that's what we ask. And we don't ask what you're browsing, because what you're browsing matters, right? It's the same way with TV. We know for kids that PBS is good and MTV is bad, right? So why don't we apply that same logic to social media? Anyways, that was a long story for me to say, hey, I question the methodology of previous research. And I think their methodology is so flawed that we're finding these relationships that don't exist. And so that's how my hypothesis for my dissertation came about. So you can see there's two main ways for these hypotheses to form. You just look at the relationship between two things, and you want to try to explain it. Or you can look at prior research and say, hey, they did something wrong, and so I want to do it better or in a different way. So yeah, so first identify a problem and we form a hypothesis. And we'll talk more about forming a hypothesis on Friday. Second, so we formed a hypothesis. Second, we need to design the research study. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes in designing a research study, but we need to figure out what variables are we going to be testing. And so we will focus more on the measurement section. I believe it's called like measuring psychological variables on the syllabus, but we'll focus this on a later time. Who will we test? So we figured out, okay, we want to test social media and self-esteem. Well, how are we going to measure social media? How are we going to measure self-esteem? That's going to be in measurement. Who are we going to be testing? So am I interested in emerging adults? Am I interested in psychology majors? Am I interested in boys, girls, adolescents, older adults? We need to figure out who we're interested in. And we'll focus more on that in the sampling section. Next, we need to figure out what research method are we going to use. So this is guided by the research question as well as the ethics, something else that we're going to get into, the ethical side of research. But we have a couple different study designs that we can choose from. We can choose from descriptive, correlational, or experimental. So we're going to focus on well, I should say we're going to focus on descriptive and correlational, but the big meat and bones of this class is on a correlational study, but let's briefly touch on all of them. So descriptive studies just involve describing characteristics or behaviors of a population. So if I wanted to know, in this class, how often people use social media, I could send a poll out and I could get a report that says on average Psych 203 students use, I don't know, an hour's worth of social media a day on average. So I can get you some basic descriptives where I'm just describing stuff about my population or my sample. Next, we can do a correlational study. So this involves examining the relationship between two variables. It could be, social media and self-esteem. It could be, I want to know if people, if how long someone studies is related to test performance. So I could do a quick study on how long did you study before the test, and then compare that to test grades. It can be anything, right? We're looking just at the relationship between two variables. And something that I'll pick up on or talk more about a little bit later when we talk about correlational studies is these two variables can be anything. So I can assess how long you've used social media and how many Nicolas Cage movies you've seen, or how many Nicolas Cage movies you've seen and how fast you can swim. You can do a correlation on anything. Doesn't mean you should. And this will go back into like design methodology. And just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And doesn't mean it'll mean anything. But we're literally just looking at the relationship between two things. Finally, you can do an experimental study. And this is where you're going to, and this is going to be the focus of 204, Psych 204. But this is where you manipulate one variable to determine its impact on another variable. It really allows us to do a cause and effect. So, if I really wanted to see if social media use influences or changes self-esteem, what I could do is, well, 1 week I want you to engage in as much social media use as possible. So I want you to do 3 hours worth of Instagram browsing a day, and I'm going to assess your self-esteem. And then the next week, what I want to do is I don't want you to use social media at all. And then I'm also going to assess self-esteem. And so we can see, does social media really cause change in our outcome, which would be self-esteem? So that's the point of an experimental study. A correlational study, we can't do that cause and effect statement. It's literally just looking at the relationship at a snapshot in time, the relationship between two variables. We can't infer cause and effect. And this is something that's going to come up repeatedly throughout the semester is a correlational study, you cannot do cause and effect. You probably heard the phrase, correlation does not equal causation. And this is something that's really, really important because it's going to, I know in your papers, many of you are going to at some point say that this means that this one variable causes change in this other variable. I know it's going to pop up in your papers. And I'm going to correct it, I'm not in, but just, you're going to hear me say it a lot. Correlation does not mean causation. You can only start to do cause and effect whenever you do an experimental study. All right, any questions so far about step 1 and 2 of the scientific method? Coming up with an idea and designing the research study. All right, let's move on to step 3. This one is, I believe the slide is extremely short, but probably one of the more longer aspects of the scientific method, but actually conducting the study. So we're going to collect data using the chosen research method. And I believe, this is the only thing on the slide, but this is probably the hardest and most time-consuming part of the scientific method. We'll focus more on about conducting the study at a later point, but just know the next step after you form the idea, design the study, you actually conduct the study and you collect the data. After you've collected the data, you need to analyze and interpret results. So data analysis involves statistics. So what did we find? And so this is something that we're going to focus on obviously later in the semester. but with the actual statistics of things. But there's a couple different types of statistics, and two we're going to focus on is descriptive and inferential. So descriptive statistics are really just summarizing, organizing, and kind of simplifying your data. So I'm going to stick with this social media and self-esteem example. Descriptive statistics out of these would be, well, what's the average social media score? Let's say we're measuring how long someone spent on social media. And so I polled all 25 of you in this class, and I have 25 different times, right? Let's say they all range between 0 minutes to 3 hours. Well, on a research paper, or just when you're presenting your research or talking about your research, I don't care about all 25 answers, right? Like I wouldn't want to see a graph or a table that has all 25 times. I care about the average. What's the average time? Or maybe what's the distribution? So I have the average, which say the average is an hour, and I want to see, how do people, are people more, are they less, are they, they fall exactly average? What's the distribution of the scores? How much do they vary from the mean? So these are the descriptives. You're not connecting any variables together. You're just merely saying, hey, let's take one variable and let's report on a couple things. The mean, maybe the mode, if you care about the mode, the distribution. So yeah. Next up is inferential. And this allows us to make generalizations about the population from a limited set of data. So inferential statistics could include things like correlations, where we say, hey, this is related to that. Or maybe it's a t-test, and we're going to say males and females differ on how long they use social media. So maybe I conducted a t-test, and this is something that I talked about last class, but we'll also talk more later in the semester. But a t-test allows us to see if there's differences between two groups. So I wanted to know, do males in this class use social media less than females in this class? So these are these inferential statistics. It allows us to make generalizations about the population from a limited set of data. And then finally, we interpret, what does this all mean? What do these results mean? I found a significant correlation between social media and self-esteem. What does that really mean? Well, it means that people who reported more social media use reported lower self-esteem. So I really went over this relatively fast because we're going to talk about this in more detail later on. But really what you need to know is, obviously the steps of the scientific method, but, particularly in this slide, be able to tell me the difference between descriptive versus inferential. All right, I think this is, I think there's 6, 5, or 7. Anyways, the next step, we've conducted the analyses, we've determined what it all means, we need to communicate the findings. So science is public, right? We want to get our knowledge out there. It does no use for me to do a study and then never tell anyone, right? That's not how science works. To be scientific, the findings must be open for other researchers to evaluate, to replicate, remember this is that replication, to verify and extend the results, forming their own hypotheses. How do we do this? We present at research conferences, we submit to peer-reviewed journal articles. Yeah, so these are some ways that we go about presenting our research to the world, and then other researchers in the world can look at our research and say, that gives me an idea. Let me form my own hypothesis, and let's expand upon this research. So we need to communicate the findings. Okay, yeah, finally, we continue the research cycle. So if your hypothesis is confirmed, right, you support your hypothesis. If I hypothesize that increased social media use is related to lower depression or lower self-esteem, I need to replicate that study to confirm its findings, right? You don't just do it once and then be like, okay, we're done. You need to replicate that. Let's say our hypothesis isn't confirmed and we find, we need to revise the hypothesis or maybe re-examine how we did our design, because maybe our design wasn't that great or it was flawed a little bit, and that can influence the results. And then finally, like we talked about in forming a hypothesis, we need to examine new questions that the research study raises. Why did we find? So we found, I did a small study here, and we found that social media is related to lower self-esteem. in this psych class. The next question hopefully would be, well, why? Why is social media related to lower self-esteem? And then I would probably do something like comparisons or, whatever, or anything else. So always think about new questions that come as a result of the findings from your study. All right, are there any questions on the steps of the scientific method? All right, so the scientific method can be used to answer virtually any question. Yeah, it's pretty simple. However, this does not mean that it should be done. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And this is something that we're really going to focus on. We're going to have like a whole day on ethics, maybe even a day or two on ethics in psychology, because that's a really important thing to consider is, is what you're doing ethical? There's an entire, it's called the IRB, I think it's called the Institutional Review Board, that reviews your study and like really tears it apart. Before you do any study, any academic study, you have to submit it to this IRB, which is consists of like professors, and they look at your study and they say, hey, this is not ethical because of X, Y, and Z reasons. Maybe because it's too much participant burden or for whatever reasons. So yeah, before any study is conducted, it has to go through a really rigorous review, and then you have to edit your review and give it back to the, it's a whole big process. So just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done. All right, so that gets at the scientific method. We have 20 minutes, which is plenty of time. I want us to get into groups. I know we don't have everyone here, which is not great. But I'm going to get us into groups. And I want you to focus, not focus on, I want you to spend the next probably, get out of here, 2:45, so it's 25, so 20 minutes. I want you to spend the next 20 minutes trying to come up with an idea for your correlational study. So let me go back. Where is it? So I want to go back and kind of focus on the correlational study, and you'll probably have about 10 minutes to talk about it. You're going to have a lot more time on Friday to discuss things with your group, but I just wanted to get you started thinking. So hopefully you read my email and you started thinking of things that are related to perceived stress, self-esteem, or one of these personality traits. I asked you to think about it in last class, and you put down answers, but this is really what this research project is about. You as a group are going to come up with a variable that you think is related to one of these things. And it has to be related to all of them. You can just pick one. Let's say you want to focus on self-esteem. I want you to think of something that could be related to self-esteem, but you got to remember that you also have to measure it. And so we're going to focus on like, how do you measure things? But I kind of gave you an idea in that email where I said, remember, we're going to ask about 5 to 7 questions to assess that construct. So think about that self-esteem, or that social media question that I asked earlier in the class. You can measure social media in multiple different ways. And so let's say you want to measure, there was a great idea of like how many likes that you get, and or the interactions, experiences that you have on social media. That's a great one. So if you want to focus on like experiences on social media, remember this operational definition. Well, how are you going to measure that? You're going to have to think of questions to ask to assess whatever you're trying to measure. And now let's say your other variable is sleep. Let's say you want to measure sleep. Well, how are you going to actually assess sleep? You can't have them come in and we can observe them sleep, right? You gotta ask questions to get at sleep, and it can be kind of difficult. Obviously, you can ask right up how many hours of sleep that you got, but we're gonna also need to assess other things as well. Anyways, what I want you to do in your group today is to not necessarily pick one of these variables. Remember, you have to pick one of these variables. And then you have to pick another variable that you come up with as a group that you think is related to one of these. But what I want you to do in group is to think of some things that are related to perceived stress, related to self-esteem, related to one of these personality traits, and think of a couple things that could be related to it. I don't want you to focus in on one idea. I want you to come up with a couple different ideas, because what's going to end up happening on Friday is I'm going to go around from groups. I want to hear your ideas, and I'm going to say, hey, I think you should focus on this one. We're not going to finalize things, I think, until the end of week 2. I'm not 100% sure what it says or what we're doing in the syllabus. Actually, I think it's until the end of week 3. So we have some time. I don't want you to solidify an idea. But yeah, so just think of some things in your group that could be related to one of these, and think of a couple different things. Any questions about what I want you to do? All right, so I think the best way to do this is I'm going to open up 5 breakout rooms. I want you to, figure out which group that you're in. Obviously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I want you to go to that breakout room that is associated with your number. So I'm going to open up breakout rooms. I'm going to let participants choose rooms set to 5. So don't go yet. Don't go yet. I'm going to create them and open all rooms. Don't go just yet. What I want you to do is think about it, write them, have someone write it down, or everyone write them down. I'm going to send in chat that one PowerPoint slide saying exact what the variables are. But what I want you to do, like I just said, is think of some other variables that are related to one of the ones that you have to choose. Anyways, go ahead, join your breakout rooms. I'm going to jump in and out in the next 15 minutes. But join your breakout rooms. If you have any question about how to do that, just speak up, and then I can put you in that room. All right, good. It looks like we have people going.